For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Welcome to the gist on Stat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our special guest today is Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram, Assistant Professor, Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, Manipal University. Her areas of expertise and interest include the impact of environmental issues on military and foreign policy. And today we'll be talking about the climate change conference taking place in Dubai, known as COP28, which begins November 30th at Expo City. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Jayaram. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and I apologize for all the glitches.
Thank you so much, and no problem. Technical glitches are very usual. Yeah.
Well, that's technology for you. You know, since we seem to have already missed out so much in terms of time, let's start with the first question, which is, I personally am very curious as to what are India's expectations from this conference and why are they so important in the strategic sense?
Yeah, so as far as India is concerned, there are many issues at stake, and I think as the finance minister, environment minister, and others within the government have stated in the previous days, I think climate finance is the #1 priority for India, and for many reasons. I think recently we have seen the OECD report, which says that, or which claims that the developed countries are finally maybe they will meet the $100 billion per year target finally. But we still have to see the veracity of it, the credibility of that claim. We don't know how much of that is in the form of loans and how much of it is in the form of grants. We still are well short of the kind of climate finance that developing countries, particularly countries like India, require, because this is a target that was set way back. So obviously the demand for climate finance has increased. So we need to look at the current realities, which require much more climate finance, particularly for adaptation. And the reality is that adaptation finance has dropped. So we still have more finance for renewable energy or clean tech, but not so much for adaptation. And countries like India require more adaptation finance today. So I think for India, in strategic terms, in terms of also meeting its own renewable energy targets, and also India has set a net zero target of 2070, and also the emissions intensity reduction targets, the carbon intensity reduction targets. So in that sense, for all these different targets, a lot of what India has achieved so far is with the help of domestic sources, especially public sources from the government, state governments, public sector undertakings. We haven't really been able to get much finance from external public sources or even private sources for that matter. 90% of the climate finance, as per India's own report or a record, says that it is through budgetary sort of spending, and of course what we have been able to mobilize through domestic sources. So this means that we still require that $1 trillion, which Prime Minister Modi mentioned at the Glasgow summit, and this has been reiterated, which we require by 2025, 2030 to meet our targets. We haven't got that. And this is where climate justice matters, historical responsibility of developed countries matters, and equity, CBDRRC as we call it, the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. This principle needs to be enshrined within the Paris Agreement and how we are going to achieve the goals set under the Paris Agreement. And this is where India's own priority is going to lie at COP28, to raise this issue and not expect countries like India to raise their mitigation ambition without the kind of finance that these countries, developing countries particularly, require. So climate finance is, I think, the #1 priority. But apart from that, I think India also would like to drive home the fact that we cannot forget the targets that were missed before 2020 by the developed countries under the Kyoto Protocol. So that cannot be forgotten as we talk about global stocktake and think about our future, strategic sort of targets, as we said. And also, if developed countries are going to set the target of 2050 as their own like net zero sort of target, it would mean that there would be much less development space or carbon space for developing countries to achieve their development imperatives. So this is something that also will be reiterated, as far as I see, by the Indian delegation. But of course, I think on the top of the list is going to be mainly about finance, which will include obviously the loss and damage fund, and the technology transfer, which has also not really happened to the extent we have been talking about for the past more than 3 decades now.
Mm-hmm. So financing and, of course, as you said, ensuring that we meet the targets, ways to meet the targets. But tell me, I was fascinated by your sort of area of expertise, which is the intersection of sort of, environment on military and foreign policies. Now, of course, nowadays everything is interrelated. But how do you think climate change has influenced India's military and foreign policies?
Yeah, so when I set out to research on this topic, there was not that much of discussion. But when I went into it deeply, then I realized that there are so many intersections as far as India's own climate diplomacy is concerned. We know that India's climate diplomacy is not just about the negotiations or COPs, the conference of parties that all countries are party to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But it is beyond that. So India has, for instance, launched the International Solar Alliance. It has launched Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. It is part of several critical, strategic partnerships on clean energy, and with countries such as the United States, then European Union, Japan, and many others. Australia. So there are many clean energy partnerships, particularly, but also generally about climate change that India has signed with several important players. Apart from that, as I said, multilateral forums, like if you look at G20 summit, recent G20 summit, this is something that, again, the Prime Minister has said that we have to revive what we agreed upon at the G20 summit on climate change at the COP28 also. So G20 summit has also emerged as a major forum where some of these climate decisions are taken. For instance, the tripling of renewable energy target or increasing energy efficiency. And even at the G20 summit, climate finance was raised as a major point of discussion. So this means that India would like to take a leadership role on climate change, particularly representing the voices of the global South. And this is something that is very critical for India's own climate diplomacy. And we've seen how India has also been using climate diplomacy as a way of increasing its outreach to developing, least developed countries, small island developing states, through even something like triangular partnerships, sometimes getting funding from the global north or, the developed countries of international financial institutions and so on and so forth. As far as the military is concerned, now this is something that is interesting, more interesting for me as a researcher, because this is something that I found out through my my research. And there are many issues that intersect with military security and military preparedness when it comes to climate change. And I think the primary one, which we all see, is that of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, because we have seen the increase in intensity and frequency of disasters, and the military, has been called to step in every time there is a major calamity within this country. And we can also see how the Indian military is cooperating with other regional militaries, and even not just in the Indian Ocean region, but beyond that now in the Indo-Pacific region. We had the NDRF, deployed in Turkey, Syria recently. So, these examples show that HADR is something that is becoming one of these primary nodes of the military itself. But beyond that, for instance, the military is also affected by climate change. Again, if you look at cyclones and, the sea level rises impacting some of our, naval bases, or may impact in the future in terms of, how these effects could show. The Siachen Glacier is another example where, there are clear indications of how the glacier has receded. due to climate change and other factors, of course. And this has also led to redeployment procedures, how the deployment procedures are being re-looked into by the Indian Army. And there are many other examples of that. I think it's also important to highlight here that the Indian Army, Navy, Air Force, these forces are also looking at emissions reduction initiatives. Like, for instance, the Indian Army is looking at green hydrogen in Ladakh, where, of course, we have a border conflict, border dispute with China. We are also looking at Navy, looking at, the Karwar Naval Base, for instance, is called a Green Naval Base, Sustainable Naval Base. It is putting into action several initiatives on using biofuels and several other initiatives to reduce its energy consumption, basically. So this is because, again, the military is known to be one of the major users of fossil fuels, and it is a major emitter, we all know. And what is it that the military can do in terms of contributing to climate action and contributing to the overall targets of the country itself? And this is where military is stepping in to some extent. Of course, you would expect more, but this is, of course, contingent on so many things. We cannot compromise on many issues when it comes to these targets as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because I remember attending a conference once at Delhi where where they were trying to sort of discuss ways to, the military and Terry were combining together to sort of see how they could, cut down on some emissions. But, you just mentioned China. China too wants to be seen as the, leader of the global South and things like that. And I think, do you think post the Xi's meeting with Biden, something has changed? Will there be a difference now at the summit? More areas of agreement?
I think this is a trend. Generally, we have seen before any climate summit, there is some level of understanding between China and US. These are the biggest emitters, and China is the largest one. US is the second largest. If you look at cumulative emissions, again, US is. Yesterday, we saw data coming out about how, if you count colonial emissions, then India, countries like India, Indonesia, China, and others are, they fall well below. Then, you count UK and Netherlands and France, some of these colonizers. And that's that apart, China and US are currently the biggest emitters. So obviously there is always that push for reaching some agreement before every COP. And that's important because otherwise reaching a consensus at COP becomes even more difficult. So I don't think strategically this is going to change the relations between China and US on other issues. On trade or technology or, on geopolitical, Indo-Pacific strategy or geopolitical dynamics. But definitely on climate, there seems to be an understanding. And this is, this is also very critical at a time when you're talking about the loss and damage fund, which was established at the Sharm el-Sheikh summit. But we have seen in the recent negotiations that happened that there is still no clarity about who will fund the loss and damage fund, who is going to finance it. Will China be allowed to use it because it continues to negotiate as a developing country? It is still part of this G77 plus China, grouping. Will China contribute to that fund? Yeah, it's highly unlikely based on CBDR and based on equity. China may not. So there are a lot of questions about where is China placed in the negotiations. It tries to be the voice of the global South, or it tries to lead these voices on equity and climate justice. But there is a huge question mark on China when it comes to its credibility. Of course, in terms of renewable energy targets, it has set high ambitious targets. It has been able to achieve a lot of these targets. There is also an understanding that China generally tends to underpromise and overachieve. So that's also something we need to keep in mind when it comes to its climate targets. It has been investing in coal. It has just recently stopped financing coal outside its territory through these BRI projects. We still don't know what is the progress that it is making. So to call China a leader on climate is something, it's misplaced in that sense. Nobody is in a position to be called a leader today because everybody is lagging behind when it comes to climate action, primarily the developed countries and also countries such as China, which have, of course, like you take another instance, China has said that it would give funding through its, through not the Green Climate Fund, which is established under the UNFCCC, but under a different fund that it has set up. Because it doesn't want to be seen as a laggard in that sense when it comes to provision of climate finance. But even in that fund, hardly 10% of that fund has actually been dispersed to developing countries or least developed countries. So there are a lot of promises being made, but we have to check like how much of that has actually been achieved, especially when it comes to supporting the initiatives of the developing countries where China hasn't really made like big progress.
I was hearing somewhere that one of the accusations against the Belt and Road projects are that they sort of violate a lot of environmental norms, and that China might actually be rebooting the BRI to sort of at least pay lip service to some of those norms to get some more credibility, and see if that helps them win back some of the trust that it originally had, because that is a thing. But even if they did that, that would, I suspect, undermine their other biggest asset, which is their speed in delivering projects. If you were to go through the routine of due diligence and getting things checked, it would slow down their delivery process. So I think they're caught in a bit of a dilemma there. But coming back to another question that I was wondering about, there's always been this argument that the developing nations are being asked to pay for the environmental damage caused by the developed nations. And there is also an argument that the most vulnerable and fragile states are receiving the least support, particularly, these islands which are on the verge of being submerged. Changed. So is that, how valid are those arguments?
Again, you look at cumulative emissions, who are the major emitters? Especially when you look at per capita emissions, these are all developed countries. So we have to look at these figures in different ways. So that means that the biggest emitters are the least, I wouldn't say the least affected, but definitely if you look at the impacts being felt by the most vulnerable countries, including the island states, least developed countries, those who have less capacities basically to deal with climate change, they are the most affected. And you look at their contribution to the greenhouse gas emissions, it's less than sometimes, even 1%, 2%, less than that, in fact. If you look at per capita emissions, it's even lower. So, so then we have to understand this whole negotiations process within the context of climate justice. And so the argument, as I mentioned earlier about the colonial emissions, is another one that was not counted for a long time. So there are still a lot of questions which we haven't really figured out in the most clear way. And then you also look at IPCC models. In fact, this issue was brought up by the Indian delegation at the Bonn Climate Conference, which happened earlier this year, the preparatory sort of conference, which happens again, annually. The Indian delegation brought up the issue of the lack of equity within IPCC models. Right. So, the scientific veracity of these models, which do not consider equity, again, you are expecting all countries to respond or to act on climate change in the same way. And that uniformity cannot be implemented, especially when you have this kind of differentiated responsibility and capacity and vulnerability. It is very clear that as we move forward, we cannot forget the fact that the pre-2020 commitments were not met by the majority of developed countries. A few of them did, but we know how, like through offsets and various other mechanisms. That is not credible enough. So obviously credibility is still lacking in the process as far as the developed countries' responsibility and their ambition is concerned. Even today, their ambition is still lacking. In fact, the developing countries seem to be doing more than their fair share of climate action as compared to the developed countries, which are still, laggards. I would say a lot of them are still laggards. They're waking up to the reality, but it's too late, and they are still. They're still sort of going through this process in a very gradual manner that doesn't really represent the urgency of the problem itself.
I'll sort of try and narrow the focus down to the last two questions, because I think I'm already getting signals that we're almost running out of time. But you mentioned that developing countries, when they because the very word that they're developing, they need to have energy and burn fuel to sort of develop. And at the same time, if you're going to tell them that you need to cut emissions and things like that, it means that you're actually hitting at development in some levels. How difficult is that trade-off, or how difficult is it to balance that?
I mean, it is a difficult path, and we have seen India struggling as well with, you have international commitments on the one side, you have climate vulnerabilities on the other side. Within India, we know how much climate change, the effects of climate change have worsened over a period of time. We are talking about low carbon development strategy, for instance, low emissions, long-term low emissions development strategy, focusing on clean energy, and other technologies basically that could help us reduce the intensity, basically the carbon intensity of our growth. So this is a difficult, something that, I wouldn't say, like we are sitting here and we know many states are facing electricity shortage. We are talking about doubling or even tripling, coal production in the upcoming years to meet this energy shortage. So yes, renewable energy can help us to a certain extent. But we know that, many of our energy requirements, the bigger proportion of our energy requirements will still be met with coal. So we cannot give up coal. So that is why, we are talking about phase down of all fossil fuels. That is another strategy that India has been consistently talking about, that, we need to include all fossil fuels. Why are we singling out coal? Why not oil and gas, which is something that, developed countries are using more? Mm-hmm. So that language is very critical as well. So this is a difficult path, but it is also imperative. We cannot like just develop in a way that would damage our resources and destroy our environment in such a way that it becomes irreversible in nature. At the end of the day, this is a global challenge. We have to have cooperation, and we have to pressurize developed countries to do more than what they are doing, but we have to do our bit as well. So, and that's something that is happening. I would say slowly institutions are also gearing up to this reality, and they are building their capacities. But this will take time. But yeah, we also have to do it fast enough now. Like, how do we match up to that requirement to something that that is also contingent on, as I said, what the rest of the world is going to do.
Mm-hmm. On a general note, are you very hopeful about something big coming out of this summit?
I mean, COPs are generally not, very optimistic. Nobody is really very optimistic about the COP process. But I would not completely discard it either. So, like last Sharm el Sheikh summit, we had the Loss and Damage Fund finally established, especially because the G77, because of the solidarity that was shown by the G77 countries. And I think this kind of solidarity needs to be shown on several issues. So that was established, but after how many years of battle? Like, decades of battle, finally it was established. So it is a very, very slow process. I completely agree with that. And it may not be, again, this is not the system that can give us the solutions that, we need very urgently. But we also need it at the same time, because this is the only forum where everybody can come together and talk about these issues, not just government actors, non-governmental, many other actors come together, lobbies come together, different lobbies come together. And it is a consensus-based decision-making process. It's one country, one vote process, right? So at least everybody has the same say, even if, power equations and other things, of course, affect how negotiations happen. But at the end of the day, decisions require consensus by all countries. So I think we cannot completely discard this particular system, but we need to overhaul it to also make sure that it can come up with solutions that are more urgent, and we can reach that consensus. But we have to look at it in the context of the geopolitics, and we have Russia-Ukraine crisis, now you have Gaza crisis, so many different geopolitical issues. And you have the ongoing, US-China, whatever dispute as well on various issues, even though they have agreed on certain issues regarding climate, like the methane pledge and things like that. But we know that in the long term, there is a trust deficit between global north, global south, or between different these groupings basically, and that trust deficit will continue to hamper climate action. But we still need the forum to advance many decisions that have been taken before.
I actually had a whole bunch of other questions lined up, but I think we're running out of time. So let me just conclude with my last question, which is that there have been these bunch of climate activists, mostly in the West, I suppose, who are defacing public property. They're sticking, gluing themselves to the pavements and roads and things like that. Do they serve a purpose? Do they actually draw attention to the perils of climate change, or are they undermining the movement?
Personally, this is my personal opinion again. I don't think this can change behavioral patterns of people. So I've lived in Germany, I've lived in Switzerland, Netherlands, and I know even in these countries, of course, there is a youth movement. There is a proportion of the youth which, resorts to these kind of methods, but I haven't seen any change in the mindsets of the people because of these kind of methods being used. It may put some pressure on the government, but it actually leads to more security measures being deployed by the government. I've seen the same activists being imprisoned and criminalized in that sense. So then it actually leads to more polarization. I feel it doesn't really serve the purpose, and it is also a section of the youth, right? I haven't seen like this is something that of course it gets a lot of media attention, no doubt about it, but beyond that, it doesn't have a large scale sort of effect on because in the end their purpose is to change the mindset of the people, and I don't think behavioral changes can be brought in by gluing yourselves to the road or throwing ketchup on some painting. That's not going to solve the problem at all. It just polarizes the discussion a little bit more, and it actually it actually leads to, it diverts attention, I think, to a large extent. And also, I feel like this is not something that represents, of course, like what is happening in developing countries where, you're talking about the present generation who are obviously worried about their jobs and, a whole lot of other things. So what does it really represent? So that's my opinion. But of course, everybody has their own ways of trying to put pressure on government and other actors, maybe fossil fuel.
I totally agree with you on that. It's at the end of the day, it annoys people. If you're going to block people by saying that stop oil, you might as well offer an alternative. You can't just block the road and say stop oil. You can't just stop oil overnight, can you? So
exactly. No, that's clear that we cannot. Of course, fossil fuels have to be phased down. That's clear. But how we do that also depends on equity and all these issues. Because in the end,
Absolutely.
Energy requirements, if they are not met, then climate discussions cannot move forward. If people are sitting without electricity at homes, they're not going to think about climate change as a priority issue.
Right. Absolutely. I like I said, I had a whole bunch of other questions, but perhaps, I'd love to have you back once this, conference ends to, sort of demystify that for us again, because I think you've done a terrific job of explaining what the whole issue is here. I know that I learned a lot, and I look forward to having you with us again on things. And in fact, I'm also keen on sort of exploring that military and, foreign policy angle a bit further with you one of these days. Maybe we'll have a longer discussion on that. Thank you so much. I know you took time out, and I know that you had a lot of patience because of these internet glitches that we faced earlier today. I really appreciate your taking time out for us, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you for inviting me, and lovely conversation. And hope to have another, like as you said, longer conversation on some of these issues. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. That was Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram from Manipal University, demystifying the issues before us at the climate conference, which begins in Dubai. I hope, like me, you learned something from this whole discussion. If you did like it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Till we meet again, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing off.